How does that relate to people who are fulfilling a job for a shorter period of time, whether it's 3 months or 6 months or something along those lines?
And that's a great question, and the answer is the person is still your employee if you are providing the control over the relationship. And I was going to get to that the next slide if you just give me a minute for you. No, that's fine. What are the penalties and why does it matter? Well, it matters because, first of all, Uncle Sam cares, right? Because there are Social Security withholding, there is unemployment contributions to be made, there are workers' comp contributions to be made, and Uncle Sam is not getting his or her fair share. And there's a lot of investigations going on across the country. There is a proposal in the Senate called the Fair Labor Standards Act, Fair Pay Amendments Act, in order to require employers to make sure that people are properly classified as employees instead of being treated as independent contractors. And interestingly, though, there was a case that just came down last month where the facts were reversed. And it was kind of a sad case. There was a man who hired a woman to take care of him. He was elderly. He needed somebody who was going to do his daily chores, who was going to take care of his daily needs, etc. She was traveling with him one day, and he accidentally killed her with his car. So her family brought a wrongful death suit against him because he did not have a relationship over whether she was an employee or an independent contractor. He actually was liable as an independent contractor for her of over $500,000. He then tried to turn around and say, well, wait a second, she was really an employee, and my workers' comp coverage should take care of that case. So beware that if you misclassify somebody as an independent contractor, and God forbid something happens where they're hurt on your premises, you might have a different kind of liability that you're dealing with. We have another question over here.
Couldn't you, or shouldn't you, indemnify yourself if you are going to have a contract employee by making sure that the company that you've contracted for that employee carries workman's compensation insurance?
Again, I agree with that. The question is, have you made sure that you have gotten the right coverage? Are they covering only your employees, or are they covering independent contractors? And I couldn't answer your question as to how you have done that. But it's certainly something worth looking into.
If I'm in my business, if I call in a temporary agency,
yeah.
I need half a dozen people to come in for 5 months or 3 months or some time period. One of them gets hurt during the course of business. It doesn't go on my workman's compensation. It goes on their workman's compensation.
Right. Right. So in that case, you've passed the risk on to the other company.
Right.
And that's one way to respond to Dune's question, which is instead of hiring somebody as a 1099, you hire them through an agency. And then that agency will take care of those types of risks for you. Another question from Chip.
Yeah, I have one right now where I give business out to other businesses to fulfill work that I sold, and that's all 1099. Is there any issue with that?
Well, there you've retained another business, right?
It's a business,
yes. So the other business is the one who's bearing the risk of making sure that the withholding is taken care of for those, because those people are employees of that other business.
Okay.
I'm just going to move forward because we're already behind. Okay, and this is a similar situation. It's better to hire a consultant because it's easier to terminate a consultant than it is to terminate an employee. And the fact of the matter is you have just as many legal risks with consultants as you do with employees. Consultants can bring claims for discrimination. In fact, there was recently a lawsuit where 2 independent contractors, and they were physicians, sued a hospital for terminating the contract on the basis of their age. And that case is recognizable in New Jersey. So again, just because you have somebody at a different relationship with you doesn't mean that you're not still vulnerable to a breach of contract claim, a discrimination claim, or a retaliation claim based on the nature of the relationship that you have with that person. Again, how to mitigate the risk? To Dune's question earlier, there are 2 ways I see. One is, as what we just discussed, which is to hire a third-party agency to provide those temporary employees. But second, the other way to do it is to just hire somebody as an employee, but in your offer letter, explain that this is a temporary job. You only have work with me for the duration of XYZ project, or you're filling in for somebody for 3 months, and at the end of that 3 months, your employment will be terminated. So it's all about setting those expectations up front that both of you know what's going to happen and how this relationship is going to move forward, and then put that person on payroll, and you have resolve the issue of the potential liability from the penalty standpoint or the misclassification standpoint. Okay. Next misunderstanding. Salaried employees are not entitled to overtime. Okay, very, very big area of misconception. The fact of paying somebody a salary is only one element of whether an employee is entitled to overtime. The real determination is based on the type of work that that person does for you. And I'll get into a little bit more specifics in a few minutes on what I mean by that. But just basically, are the duties rote or are they discretionary? Is the job a creative job? Does the job require an advanced degree? Just some of the potential issues that may revolve around whether or not somebody is entitled to overtime. But the basic rule is, and this is across the country, everybody is called a non-exempt employee, meaning everybody is entitled to overtime unless you can establish an exception. And there are really only 5 limited exceptions. And you have to establish that exception in order not to pay somebody overtime. And I'll give you what those exceptions are. Again, very high level understanding of what those exceptions might be. Similar issue, commissioned salespeople are not entitled to overtime. Again, kind of the same thing in terms of who is paid, who is not paid, how much do you pay people. I'm going to give you a history lesson here. The Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, and anybody know what year?
1995.
You can give me a decade. 1940s. The 30s. The 30s. It was part of the New Deal. Okay, and back then in the 30s, who were the outside salespeople?
Men.
Good, but what kind of sales would was being performed back then?
Door to door.
Door to door, exactly. Vacuum cleaners, encyclopedia, shoe salespeople. What happens today if you have a door-to-door salesperson come to your door?
Get shot.
Exactly. Right, you call the police, you pull down the window shades, you might hide behind the couch. You know, there's no such thing as a door-to-door salesperson anymore. That industry is completely dead. But the law has not changed since the 1930s as to who is an outside salesperson. So the key is an outside salesperson must, one, be outside. Very good. And 2, they must be taking orders in the course of their job. So the important thing to know about the outside sales exemption is that this person has to be outside. I had a client or a case about 10 years ago. I represented a mortgage sales company. And this was the late 90s, so a little more than 10 years ago, and everybody was refinancing their homes. And mortgage sales were just through the roof. And we had a sales force that was all telephone sales. But all the employees were commissioned salespeople. And these were people who were like right out of college making $150,000, $200,000 a year because they were doing such a great job at sales. And Department of Labor showed up at the door. These people are all non-exempt employees. They are entitled to overtime for the work they're doing. And we're saying, what? What are you talking about? They're salespeople. They're commissioned. Doesn't matter. They're not outside salespeople. They were inside. They were making phone sales. And on the basis of that, it cost the company about $4 million just in overtime because the people were making so much money. Another question from Dune.
Outside, is it outside of the office or does it have physically outside under the sky? Like if you have salespeople who make calls on the road and not office bound, does that consist of outside?
They have to be regularly engaged away from the business. Okay, regularly engaged away from the business. Another question up here, Chris. Another question up here.
What if they're salary plus?
Even if they're salary plus, you still may owe them overtime. In fact, that would be bad because both the salary and the plus is incorporated into determining what their hourly rate is, and then the overtime would be calculated against that salary plus. So when you're talking about, what is overtime, overtime is you take how much total compensation that person makes in a week, you divide it by 40 to break it down to an hourly rate, and then for every hour, not by 40, you would divide it by the number of hours they worked that week. So if they worked over 40, if they worked 50 hours, you divide it by 50. If they worked 75 hours, by 75. So it's going to vary. and then you take every hour over 40, and you add a half time on top of that for that week. I know it's complicated, so I can do a graph for you at some other point, but it adds up very quickly. Let me put it that way. Yes, Ron?
How do they determine how many hours were worked in addition? If somebody isn't punching a clock,
Right.
how do they figure it out?
It's amazing how hardworking your employees become. You never realized it, but that's the problem. That's one of the issues when
just make it up?
Well, I'm sure that they would not tell you that. It wouldn't be made up. It would be, I honestly worked 50 hours this week, and I'm going to testify that that's what I worked, even if you have no records of it. And that's where the quandary comes in.